Hello and welcome to the United Nations Association in Canada's digital event for the Toronto Region Branch, UN75 2020 and beyond, shaping our future from Toronto. I'm your host, Yazan. Today, the United Nations marks a very special milestone, its 75th anniversary. To celebrate, UNACTO has brought together guests to discuss Canada's most challenging issues and solutions for building a more sustainable world as part of the global conversation for change. Here's what some of our leaders have to say to mark the occasion.
Dear friends, the 75th anniversary of the United Nations falls in the middle of a global pandemic. Our founding mission is more critical than ever: to promote human dignity, protect human rights, respect international law, and save humanity from war. When the pandemic hit, I called for a global ceasefire. In our world today, we have one common enemy, COVID-19. Now is the time for a stepped-up push for peace to achieve a global ceasefire. The clock is ticking. And we must also make peace with our planet. The climate emergency threatens life itself. We must mobilize the whole world to reach carbon neutrality, net zero emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050. A growing number of cities, countries and companies have already pledged to meet this goal. Around the world, we must do more to end human suffering from poverty, inequality, hunger and hatred, and fight discrimination on the basis of race, religion, gender, or any other distinction. The months of pandemic have seen a horrific rise in violence against women and girls. We must build on progress. A remarkable global collaboration is underway for a safe, affordable, and accessible COVID-19 vaccine for all. The Sustainable Development Goals give us an inspiring blueprint for recovering better. We face colossal challenges. With global solidarity and cooperation, we can overcome them. That's what the United Nations is all about. On this anniversary, I ask people everywhere to join together. The United Nations not only stands with you, the United Nations belongs to you and is you with the peoples. Together, let us uphold the enduring values of the United Nations Charter. Let us build on our advances across the decades. Let us realize our shared vision of a better world for all.
Hello everyone, bonjour à tous. This year, we mark the 75th anniversary of the United Nations and the signing of the UN Charter. And as we reach this milestone, in the midst of a global pandemic that has affected the health and economic well-being of people around the world, the need for us to work together has never been greater. Because the harsh reality is that we are a world in crisis. Countries around the world are facing the immediate challenge of COVID-19, along with the existing challenges of climate change, violent extremism, escalating numbers of displaced people and migrants, and so many others. And these challenges do not have borders. Depuis 75 ans, les Nations Unies sont une organisation qui aide le monde à s'attaquer aux enjeux les plus graves qui surviennent. Elle constitue un forum fondé sur des valeurs communes qui a donné lieu à des transformations profondes et à des résultats positifs pour des millions de personnes, notamment nos populations les plus vulnérables. Et en ce moment, pendant qu'on travaille à protéger les gens, les Nations Unies peuvent jouer un rôle déterminant si on profite de l'occasion pour rebâtir un avenir meilleur pour nos enfants et nos petits-enfants. Canada was there at the beginning of the UN, and Canada will continue to be there. Because we know that we can accomplish more together, united as people, communities, and countries. I want to thank the United Nations Association in Canada Toronto Region Branch for putting on this event and for all their wonderful work in the community. I hope everyone enjoys this virtual event and is inspired by today's speakers. Encore une fois, merci.
Hello, Mayor John Tory here. I'm pleased to join this virtual Toronto celebration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. It's hard to imagine a world without a United Nations. On those challenges we simply must take on as challenges before the entire world, the United Nations is that place of collaboration, that place of sharing, that place of setting shared goals. By declaring a decade of people of African descent, for example, the United Nations showed global leadership and has offered a compass for all of us as we confront fundamental issues of systemic racism and inequality of opportunity. What challenge is more global than climate change and sustainability? And it will be at the United Nations where we stand an excellent chance of achieving the cooperation and the innovation we need to meet our goals. And of course, international peace and security. Not an issue which occupies Canada as much as might be the case elsewhere, but in the most diverse city in the world, there are many deeply held concerns about this. And again, the United Nations still represents one of the best places to address those issues. The 75th anniversary should also represent a time when the people of Toronto should confirm their support for the United Nations, for its charter, for its mission, and for the principle of people and nations working together day in and day out to share in the solving of global problems and in helping to improve the lives of people around the world. Happy 75th anniversary, United Nations.
75th anniversary of the United Nations marks a milestone in Canada's history. Its creation came out of the aspirations for a better, more peaceful, and just world following the bloodiest war known to the planet. Canadians were at the very first table supporting the creation of this body, which would bring countries and peoples together to prevent wars, provide humanitarian relief, and establish global norms for a better world. While Prime Minister Mackenzie King was signing the Charter of the United Nations, that begins with the indelible call for a better world, we, the people of the United Nations. In Canada, a civil society organization of citizens came together to throw their full support to the founding of the United Nations. And that, also 75 years ago, was created the United Nations Association Canada. As President of UNA Canada, 2020 is a moment to acknowledge, along with you today and the peoples of Canada, that engaged citizens made a difference in 1945 as they make a difference now. UNA Canada's polling shows a whopping 88% of Canadians of all political stripes and sectors support Canada's engagement with the United Nations. UNA Canada is a charity with membership of Canadians who value the critical role the United Nations has played in each of our lives. From coast to coast to coast, in volunteer branches across the country, members come together to engage their communities in understanding what it means to be a global citizen and in initiatives to show the local is global. Our daily work focuses on bringing us together around shared aspirations for a better world. UNA Canada has worked to develop the Canadian UN Leaders of the Future through our historic UN internship program. UNA Canada accelerates climate action through work integrated learning opportunities for talented but and underemployed young grads to work in the green economy. Our work engages and shares learning and community engagement on the UN Sustainable Development Goals through youth ambassadors. And of course, we bring together thoughtful, experienced internationalists to shape the role of Canada in the larger world. I am so proud of the work of our volunteer branches. A very special thank you to Arete Koshelski, President of UNA Canada's Toronto branch, and her team in bringing leading thinkers about our shared future together today. Our Toronto branch is the largest in Canada. This moment, as we are witnessing the power of the work of the UN through the leadership of the World Health Organization in ensuring, as one example, that any vaccine developed to address COVID-19 is equally available to those in the world's poorest countries, and through the recognition of the Nobel Prize to the World Food Program. As you seek ideas for the future of the UN, reflect too on its path. At challenging times, having a table to which all are invited, despots, dictators, democrats, a table perhaps unlovely, but where a chair is kept warm for each of us, is perhaps the true gold standard in creating understanding, in creating norms, and a more peaceful and secure future for us all. The UN at its core is each of us. I hope you'll join us and become members and supporters. Our work is vital. Thank you. Good luck with your day and happy 75th birthday.
The United Nations is marking its 75th anniversary at the time of great challenge. A conversation on how we can shape our future together is vital as never before. Solidarity and cooperation on a global and local level are crucial. We need to listen one another, understand one another, and act as one to protect and prepare the next generation to inherit our world. So let's shape a somewhat better, peaceful, and sustainable future. And let's do it together. Tonight's celebration, UN75, 2020 and beyond, Shaping Our Future from Toronto, is one of our signature events that we are happy to share with you. Thank you for joining us.
Hello everyone, we are pleased to mark the UN 75th anniversary by participating in the largest ever global conversation, UN75 2020 and beyond. In a time of change and complex issues, from the COVID-19 pandemic to the climate crisis, we need multilateral action more than ever. Through UN75, the United Nations invites everyone to join the conversation and define how we can create a better future by 2045, when the UN turns 100. The world needs more solidarity. Let's work together to create a better future for all.
The conversation towards greater global solidarity requires the voices of those driving these changes in their communities, especially with the changes faced by COVID-19, climate change, and inequality, both in Canada and around the world. UNACTO is pleased to welcome these next guest speakers, all leading global change right from Toronto.
As I think about the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, I'm really mindful that many people feel the world is in crisis. I'm reminded of philosopher Antonio Gramsci, who said, "The old world is dying, the new one is not yet born, now is the time for demons." Well, that's optimistic, and it predicts a new world, but one not yet born. How do we get there? I think we need to be frank in acknowledging there is a lack of trust in government. It's endemic. Not just anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers, but we all know neighbors who doubt government's ability or desire to look after them. They're not wrong. I think we deserve that. The impact of globalization, continuing existence of racism and economic disparity, and on it goes. Despite all this, on the 75th anniversary, I'm optimistic. I think it's a time for renewal, and I think we're poised for renewal. I would like to also think that this time around, people will take advantage of what Indigenous peoples have to offer the world in its renewal. You know, too often Indigenous communities are seen as something to fix, to repair, not as people to learn from. And I want to share a few areas where I think that we can learn from Indigenous people as we move forward. First, it's not uncommon to our people, particularly the Haudenosaunee, of which I am one, better known as Six Nations or some quarters Iroquois Confederacy. Others thought they had invented the United Nations. Well, frankly, centuries ago, our peoples who had previously been warring, were very different from one another, came together to form the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. They have much to offer in terms of conflict resolution. And I think there's much there to mine. Treaty making is an art that Indigenous peoples are well versed in. Secondly, I think reciprocity is an area where Indigenous peoples bring value. As activist Rebecca Adamson put it, she said about reciprocity, I have the honor of giving, the honor of receiving. I honor you by giving, you honor me by receiving. Well, she is an Indigenous visionary. And outside of Indigenous communities, we don't often see ourselves in relationship to land, to others around us. Often people consider themselves, societies think of themselves as the creator, as acting upon their environment. But Rebecca reminds us that at its heart, reciprocity is not about the individual acting upon the world. It's about a relationship. And the relationship has to be mutual, holistic, and concerned about more than one thing, frankly. These are views shared by Indigenous communities around the world. If you look at the Zapotecas in Mexico, when they say thank you, it's translated into English literally to mean I will reciprocate. If you look at Article 2 of the Bolivian Constitution, it says Bolivia is founded in the principles of unity, solidarity, and reciprocity. And we all know of the indigenous influence in Bolivia. On the Pacific coast of North America, the potlatch provided benefits essential to sustainable communities, such as redistribution of wealth, the claiming of status and rights to hunting and fishing territory, all based on reciprocity. So I think there is much there to mine for the world to mine as we chart the way forward. The third area is perhaps the most obvious, stewardship over the land. And it goes beyond land acknowledgement. It goes to including and truly creating an inclusive way of shaping the future of the world that will involve Indigenous values and, once again, relationships with land. I could go on, but these are the kinds of teachings that Indigenous people bring to the table as we start the process of renewal in celebrating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. I think these are the kind of values that will enable us to restore trust that I spoke of earlier that is waning and in many areas lost amongst people. I think if we are going to restore trust, we need to be bold and we need to demonstrate that we're above all willing to be held accountable to the things that we promise one another. This takes tremendous courage. Once again, taking a leaf out of the Haudenosaunee original council, women had their own council. It was a matriarchal society, and women were known as the conscience. They are the people who hold others accountable for their actions. And I think we are sorely in need of accountability mechanisms, both domestically and internationally, when it comes to Indigenous peoples and our treatment of Indigenous peoples. We all know of the court cases that mount when Indigenous peoples are obliged to turn to courts for redress, but they're expensive. They declare a winner and a loser. They do not allow us to shape a future together. And so I think in the 75th anniversary, it's a time to set our sights on new institutions, newly empowered institutions, where we are willing ourselves domestically in Canada and internationally, we're willing to be held accountable for our promises, for our ongoing and oft-repeated commitments to create a better relationship with Indigenous peoples. I think we require strong mechanisms to hold nations accountable. Yes, we have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It took many years and tremendous advocacy amongst Indigenous people to have that at long last embraced. And I'm thrilled to have seen it happen. But our people are all too familiar with promises made and then not honored. I think in my own community about the Cayuga Nation chief Descahe, who in 1923 went to the then League of Nations to look for acknowledgement, recognition of the rights of our people to self-determination. You know, at that time, Canada retaliated, dissolving traditional councils or attempting to do so. Descahe was prevented when he left Canada to go and give a speech. He was prevented from returning to Canada and lived out his life in exile. He is quite a hero amongst many of our people at Six Nations because he looked for sanctions. He looked for accountability. He looked for others to honor their promises to the people of our community, promises made long ago. And so as we think about the future, I will acknowledge we have made tremendous progress from the time of Descahe. I will acknowledge with great optimism that we are poised for even greater progress. I was encouraged when the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was at long last passed and accepted by Canada as well as many nations around the world. I'm encouraged that there's a growing awareness brought about in large part by the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, headed by now Senator Marie St. Clair. There is a growing commitment to change relationships with Indigenous peoples. And I think what we now need are concrete steps to hold ourselves accountable. There is a commitment to pass UNDRIP into law in Canada. I believe we need a mechanism to report out and hold government accountable on how it is we are doing year over year in honoring our commitments. I also believe we need an international mechanism to do the same, to hold nations internationally accountable, not a forum, not a committee to discuss, but a mechanism to hold nations accountable, and accountable for their relationship with Indigenous peoples around the world. Accountable for what I believe should be a universal commitment to honor and support sustainable Indigenous communities for the future. One of the strong principles in the United Nations, the UNDRIP, one of the rights that's strongly recognized that resonates well with me and our work at Inspire, is the right to education. And of course, our North Star is that within a generation, every Indigenous student should graduate. I believe this is achievable. 90% of the students we support, in fact, do graduate. But you know, they must be educated and graduate as Indigenous peoples. Surely we have learned this. And once they achieve that graduation, they will be well positioned to live the value of reciprocity. to give back to their communities and to give to the world. I think this is the promise of the future as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And one last very powerful teaching of my own people, something that sustains me every day, I'd like to share as a gift on this anniversary. And that is the obligation to measure all that we do each and every day by the impact it will have on the seventh generation whose faces we can see coming towards us. This is not an abstract belief. This is a strong promise for the future, a future that I hope across the world will truly engage Indigenous peoples and all that we have to offer as we work together for a future for the seventh generation. I acknowledge and celebrate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. Ona.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm so pleased to be connecting here with you today on the important occasion of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. My name is Stephanie Day, and I'm the National Coordinator for the We Empower program. We Empower is a joint initiative of the European Union, UN Women, and International Labour Organization that focuses on responsible business conduct in G7 countries. With operations in Canada, Japan, and the US, we have convened conversations about gender equality and women's economic empowerment in the workplace, marketplace, and community. I have worked closely with dedicated stakeholders across the public sector, private sector, and civil society to advance gender equality and women's economic empowerment. I have been so encouraged by the strong efforts of our community, nationally and globally, to ensure women's rights are front and center, especially during this difficult time as we try to respond and recover from COVID-19. COVID-19 has exposed cracks in our political, social, and economic systems. The far-reaching social and economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic are disproportionately affecting women around the world. From a significant rise in violence against women, including domestic violence, to women's disadvantage in labor markets, women are carrying the bulk of unpaid care and domestic work. There is an estimated increase of 9.1% of the poverty rate for women. It is estimated that due to the pandemic in 2021, 47 million additional women and girls will be pushed into extreme poverty, bringing the total to 435 million. The consequences of the pandemic threaten to undo decades of progress and many of the hard-won advances. The COVID-19 crisis, coupled with international protests against racism and discrimination, has demonstrated that we are far from what we coined generation equality. A world where we become the generation that wipes out gender inequality. 25 years after the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, we acknowledge that some progress toward gender equality has been made. Over the past decade, 131 countries have passed laws to support women's equality, including to increase access to healthcare and good quality education, and to promote women's political participation and representation. But yet still, not a single country has achieved gender equality. We know that achieving true equality means not only turning the tables on gender injustices, but rooting out all forms of oppression. This type of radical action requires the support of our entire community. Implementing the WEPs with an intersectional lens is a great framework to embrace as we build back equally. The Women's Empowerment Principles are a set of principles offering guidance to businesses on how to promote gender equality and women's empowerment in the workplace, marketplace, and community. Established by UN Global Compact and UN Women in 2010, the WEPs are informed by international labor and human rights standards and grounded in the recognition that businesses have a stake in and a responsibility for gender equality and women's empowerment. The WEPs are a primary vehicle for corporate delivery on gender equality dimensions of the 2030 Agenda and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. On the occasion of the 75th anniversary, we need to revisit the founding principles of the United Nations, those that are grounded in human rights and equality, and apply them holistically to the challenges of today. Thank you.
My name is Rima Bazzi, and I want to offer a warm welcome to everyone tuning in today to help us celebrate this anniversary. Today we're seeking to reflect on the past, but more importantly, to discuss and reimagine our collective beyond. What if I told you that the demographic facing some of the most significant challenges under COVID-19 are some of the least represented in decision-making spaces? Young people are projected to experience some of the most long-lasting and persistent impacts because of COVID-19. For example, the International Labor Organization projects that young people are roughly twice as likely to face unemployment than adults. Furthermore, young people are more likely to face unjust labor conditions, precarious labor, and also less likely to complete their educations because of these impacts. Each and every one of us knows and understands that we are in unprecedented times and in uncharted territory. We know and understand that COVID-19 has challenged us to think beyond the paradigm of our normal and to reimagine what the structures and principles of society should look like. Of course, this moment in time helps us realize that we've made significant strides in improving the outcomes of communities all over the world, but it has also shown us that our normal just doesn't suffice, and that there's significant work that needs to be done for us to achieve sustainability, equitability, and well-being-oriented global communities. The sudden erosion of our normal and the shedding of light on the gaps and inequities that exist might make many of us feel burnt out or overwhelmed, and it might even make us feel like this is just how things are and how they will continue to be. But there are countless examples of young people all over the world who have continued to make strides in positive social change even amid COVID-19 circumstances. Whether it's young healthcare workers and med students in Italy who have volunteered their time and safety to save lives, or the youth Red Cross volunteers in Jordan and in Haiti who are running hand-washing campaigns and increasing awareness of health and safety protocols, or even the young people leading charity events to fund PPE access all over the United States and Canada to make sure that equitably PPE is accessible. This shows us that young people have an innate understanding that grassroots effort and collective action is a key input into making us and helping us emerge from these difficult circumstances. It is because of this that I want to dedicate this message to all the young people all over the world who may be watching this and who have placed their communities ahead of themselves and who have continued to act innovatively and in the spirit of the collective and greater good. Global impact begins with the local, and there is no amount of effort and dedication to positive social change that is too small or that goes unnoticed. Because of this, you guys are on the forefront of redefining and redirecting our future. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights recognizes that participation is a fundamental human right. This means that young people are entitled, in fact, to participate in the conduct of public affairs. This can be both globally and also locally. But importantly, participation does not have a uniform definition. When we think of formal participation, we might think of political, electoral, or policy development processes. But more importantly, there's an informal participation that exists at the community and grassroots level, and maybe even in digital spaces like this one. In 2019, I had the opportunity to attend the Y20 in Japan, which is the official forum to the annual G20, but for young people. The Y20 sought to bring together 2 young people from each respective G20 country and provided us with a platform to brainstorm and negotiate policy ideas that address issues in areas such as international trade, business and the environment, and the future of work. Coming out of this forum, we realized that there was a united and uniform conscience on the importance of the circular economy, of reducing plastic use, and more importantly, of developing robust mechanisms to support and uphold human rights for all of those folks all over the world who are facing precarious and unjust labor conditions. What I learned from this experience is that young people can come to the table with pragmatic, implementable, and bold ideas that are not necessarily tethered to a status quo. In 2016, for example, I worked in refugee resettlement where I was on the front line of the Syrian refugee crisis in Vancouver. I had the opportunity of a lifetime to work with a team and host a Syrian youth consultation where we invited 50 young people who had recently arrived in Canada, and we asked them to solution for some of the most pressing issues that they had faced in their resettlement journey. We discussed subjects such as education, healthcare, transportation, language, and community. And each participant made suggestions that were pragmatic policies that we later used to bridge service gaps that were regularly faced by marginalized communities arriving in Canada. This opportunity, most importantly, left me with 3 key lessons that have carried with me throughout my personal and professional growth. Firstly, that there is power and potential in leveraging our experiential knowledge to help mold policies into inclusive and accessible shapes and forms. Secondly, that ideas are meaningful and impactful regardless of the level of education you may have or the years of experience under your belt. And thirdly, and maybe most importantly, that young people are some of the most resilient and innovative during turbulent and uncertain times just like these ones. Participation is important, but meaningful participation is what's invaluable. This means that incorporating the voices of young people via consultation is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Enabling spaces where young people are seen and respected as equal partners with equal voices, value, and influence goes far beyond the scope of just consideration and moves to actively incorporate our ideas and experiences into the policy process. Although research has shown time and time again that investment in youth inclusion and decision-making is a crucial input to both our personal and professional development, and it has shown to strengthen democracy and democratic process, channels for young people's participation remains minimal. The key here is to provide tools and platforms needed for young people to become equal discussion partners and to gain credibility. When this comes to fruition, it might look like hosting more forums such as the Y20, but both on a local and global scale. Or it can look like creating regular discussions and discussion forums between young people and their political and bureaucratic leaders. Or it can mean creating more channels for direct investment in the ideas of young people. We make up 50% of the global population, but we do not have paralleled representation in decision-making spaces. As we move towards reimagining the future and brainstorming creative ways to help us meet the Sustainable Development Goals and to help us cultivate a new world within and outside of COVID-19, it's important to remember that amplifying and incorporating youth voices is not just about the now, and it's not just about us. Empowered young people turn into empowered adults, which turn into empowered leaders. Investing in youth voices means working towards our collective sustainability and resilience both on a short-term and long-term basis. So allow me to reiterate. If you're a young person and you've tuned into this event to help celebrate the UN 75th, I want you to take this message as a call to action and as a message of encouragement. If you want to get involved, but you're not sure where to start, reach out to your local organizations, volunteer your time, and reach out to your political leaders. Make sure you express your bold and innovative ideas, and don't be held back by the thought that maybe you might not have enough experience or you might not have enough education. The knowledge that you bring forward through your experience as a young person is valuable enough. Thank you.
So what does the future hold for Canada in the United Nations? What do we need to do to take us to 2045 when the UN turns 100? To answer that, I am pleased to introduce a special keynote speaker, recently appointed as Canadian Ambassador to the United Nations. He previously served as the 21st Premier of Ontario. Please welcome the Honourable Bob Rae.
Hello, everyone. I'm Bob Rae, and I'm Canada's new ambassador to the United Nations. I'm delighted to be with you by means of this rather impersonal technology that we're all working with these days. I would much prefer to be with you in person and able to watch your body language and your facial expressions and your various attitudes to what I have to say and be able to gauge my remarks accordingly. And see you in person, which I would really have much preferred, but this will have to do for the time being. It's a great pleasure to be with you and a great pleasure to be celebrating UN 75 with my Toronto friends. It is an extraordinary time at the UN, as it is everywhere. We're very much impacted by COVID in our work patterns and how we are able to engage with one another. There's not anywhere near as much in-person diplomacy as all of us would have liked. But we are carrying on. We have work to do. The UN General Assembly is meeting now in its various committees. We've come through a busy but kind of weird high-level week where we actually haven't had any high-level people come physically, but a lot of people have visited us on YouTube and Zoom and all the other technologies that people are using these days. And I guess I just would take this opportunity to reflect a little bit on the UN at 75 and then to talk a bit more about the future, about the present in terms of COVID and the impacts that we're seeing globally, and then to talk a bit more about the future. Well, you know, we came out of the experience of the war. You have to forgive me for that interruption. I'll just turn it off as best I can. A little bit of reality. And really, I think you've got to trace the origins of the UN, not only to the experiences and failures of the League of Nations, but also to the Atlantic Charter, and to the fact that after the depth of the Nazi threat and the Soviet threat to the peace of Europe became clear, that it was incumbent on initially Roosevelt and Churchill, but then on a lot of other countries as well, to really try to begin to develop a greater common sense of what the war was about, how would the war come about, and what was it going to take to give the war a better meaning than had been able to emerge from World War I. And so our foundational documents are really two. One is the Atlantic Charter, and the other is the Charter of the UN itself, which was drafted in 1945. But the drafting of it had really gone on between 1941, 42, and 1945. And you can see in the document and in all of the work that went into San Francisco, a very real determination to say we have to do things differently, and we're part of something bigger that has really been taking place gradually over many, many decades. And that something bigger is a commitment to certain global universal principles, which were later expressed in the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention and a number of other documents that are really critical reflections of the nations united by the experience of war and united by their determination to, as they put it in 1945, save future generations from the scourge of war. And I think that principle is really key to understanding what the UN has really been all about since 1945. I think it's been, more than anything else, it's been about trying to create a world that is governed by the rule of law. And law in its broadest meaning, in its broadest context. Law is reflecting social and economic needs. Law is reflecting, obviously, transparency, the basic principle that no one is above the law and that nations unilaterally can't break the bonds of peace and the bonds of solidarity. And I think those principles are as valid today, if not more so, than they were in 1945. There are those who say, well, you know, and I'm reaching out my dad's copy of the Charter. The Charter, they say, well, that's it. It's all in here. And they're sort of like the way you have originalists interpreting the U.S. Constitution. We here have originalists interpreting the Charter. Certainly that's what the Russians do, the Chinese do, in their own way as well. And it's kind of ironic when you think about it, because the real story of the United Nations is not just the Charter. The real story of the United Nations is all that we have done since 1945. The commitments we've made to peacekeeping, for example, Canada's strong role in that, And let's not forget, we played a role in peacekeeping, not only in Suez when we invented peacekeepers, but in Korea when we invented the principle that we could be united for peace and attempting to stop what was correctly seen as aggression. And parallel to that, in terms of the political work, if you like, of the United Nations, the peacekeeping work, the attempts to establish and maintain the peace, has been all of those institutions which were intended to create broader economic and social rights. And the Economic and Social Council is a founding institution of the United Nations and is, in a sense, a parallel. The next process that overtook the UN was obviously the process of decolonization, which has really been a critical transformational reality of the world since 1945, that whole empires that had managed to hold themselves together after 1919 collapsed after 1945. And so you have this process of sovereignty of independence. Quietly, Canada had been slowly gaining more sovereignty and independence on its own. I mean, we finally ended appeals to the British House of Lords in 1949. We got our own constitution back in 1982. So when you look at, our own parallel process to this huge process of decolonization in Africa and in Asia, which has been totally transformative. The transformation, the change in the makeup of the Soviet Union, the breakup of the Cold War and its replacement by a number of other issues and conflicts. The process of creating the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which was, if you like, a further development of the decolonization trend that was in place. The growth of stronger institutions like the International Criminal Court, like the Landmines Treaty, like efforts to establish, extend slowly in every conceivable way in social fields, in political fields, in economic fields, this notion of the rule of law, of how we're going to resolve not only political and military disputes, but how we're going to resolve social and economic disputes as well. And that's really what's given rise to the modern UN, with all of its imperfections and tensions. I've quoted before, and I'll quote again, the famous comment that to blame the United Nations for all of the wars and problems and conflicts that remain unresolved in the world is a lot like blaming Madison Square Garden if the Knicks lose. I mean, the fact is that the fault is not in our stars. The fault is in ourselves. We blame the institution for the fact that the members of the institution really bear responsibility for what happens and how it works and how it doesn't work. Which really brings me to where we are today and what the future looks like. COVID has revealed a lot about the world, which is not pretty. It shows us more divided than we might have thought. It shows that there's still a push towards isolationism, that there's still a push towards saying, how can we get out of this ourselves? How can we get there first? How can we get there ahead of everybody else? A growth of nationalism, a growth of xenophobia, a growth of racism, forces that we thought had been contained and had been curtailed are unfortunately making a big comeback. And those forces are not a force for good. Mr. Pearson said, a quote that I just saw the other day, he said that at the very time when we got our sovereignty and independence, we had to come to terms with the fact that we were living in a world that only made sense if we recognized our interdependence. And that it's only when we come together to recognize that interdependence that we're going to get anywhere. COVID makes that truer than ever before. It's never been more true than today that we need a greater sense of global solidarity. Not just because of COVID and because of what I think are very, very powerful economic and social repercussions that it's going to have, but also because of climate change. because that is, I think, forcing the world to come to grips with not just our survival from the prospect of a nuclear war, but survival from the prospect of failing to deal with the impact of climate change and the impacts of global warming. And that, I think, is going to be equally compelling as to why we need this institution and why we need to strengthen the bonds of multilateralism, why we need to reinforce a much more profound and deep sense of what we owe ourselves on this planet and in this world. And that, I think, is becoming an ever-increasing reality, an ever-increasingly powerful and meaningful challenge for us and for all the countries in the world. And I think Canada has a very positive and strong role to play in this regard. I think we can, in fact, make a difference, not on our own, but in two main ways. One is because we've always been thinkers about the global order. We've always had people who, going back a long way, had a lot to say about how do we do these things. Whether it's the formation of the GATT or the creation of the UN Declaration of Human Rights or Suez and the role of peacekeeping, that's whether it's the International Criminal Court or the Landmines Treaty, we have been present at all of those points of creation. We've been present at every single point of creation, and not just present as an observer, but present as an active and creative participant. And secondly, we can do it because we know how to work with others. It's our ability to work effectively with others that puts us at the heart of what needs to be done. We're not going to be able to do it on our own, but we can do it by working with a whole lot of other countries that depend a great deal on this spirit of multilateralism. And we are going to need to create a new architecture for world security, a new architecture for economic justice, a new architecture to strengthen human rights and extend them, and a new architecture as to how to make sure that we're able to do what we say we want to do, and in fact strengthen multilateralism and not weaken it, make it even stronger and make it even better. That, I think, is Canada's mission at the moment. I think it's very much part of what's in our interest as a country to do. And I think it's also very much in the interest of the organization. And frankly, I think it's in the interest of the planet. So thank you so much for joining me. It's been a great pleasure to be with you. And I wish you the very best in your work and deliberations. And thanks to the UN Association of Toronto for your wonderful support and help to what we're doing. Thank you.
As we come to a close, I must emphasize that the conversation doesn't just end here. Join our conversation. Let your voice be heard. Follow along on social media through @joinUN75 and share your thoughts directly with others around the world.
Our world is facing unprecedented challenges. Climate change is altering natural balance. And our precious wildlife is struggling to survive. We are battling a new era of conflict and violence. There's the disruptive impact from digital technologies and shifting demographics with gaping inequalities. Now, a global epidemic is reshaping our world as we know it. We are at a crossroad at a time when our world seems so divided. Our world is struggling to breathe. For the United Nations 75th anniversary, we set out to ask the world, what are your hopes for your future?
If you could choose one thing to say to the UN, to world leaders about the future, what would that be?
In January 2020, the United Nations launched a global initiative to have the world's largest conversation on the future we want. Discussions have taken place in all settings, from classrooms to boardrooms, parliaments to village halls across the world, in order to reach as many people as possible. The United Nations listened, and the world spoke.
justice, equality, and freedom for all.
People can really be in peace and with dignity, because our dignity was taken away from us because of our religion and because of who we are. And I hope that we are the last community who are suffering of those problems.
Health is often looked at as an expense. It is not. It is an investment.
We change by exchanging without losing ourselves.
We have run out of excuses and we are running out of time.
If we don't stop the destruction of our natural world, nothing else will matter.
More than ever before, we need solidarity, hope, and the political will to see this crisis through together.
From what we have heard, the world is not as divided as we thought. The global economy, healthcare, sanitation, education, and the hardest places hit are our top priorities from recovering from the pandemic. In response to COVID-19, greater international solidarity is urgently needed. The threat of climate change and destruction of our natural environment is the biggest fear for the future. We need increased efforts to reduce conflict and violence, and we aspire to further protect human rights. For optimism about our future, we need to look to our young people. The overwhelming majority of us believe global cooperation is more vital than ever.
Every time we fail to find solutions to global challenges, the most vulnerable people in our societies are hit the hardest.
Throughout history, we have accomplished unimaginable things, propelling each generation further than the last. There is no limit to the amount of good we can achieve together to make this world, our world, a better place. The challenges before us are universal, and we know that these challenges demand global solutions. We have the blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. The Sustainable Development Goals. In 2045, the United Nations 100th year, let's see the change we have implemented today that will shine a light on our children's tomorrow.
Change is coming. The real power belongs to the people.
And I want to turn the question inside out as well. I will not ask, how dare you? Instead, I will ask, do you dare to?
This is the most urgent of times and the most urgent of messages. Now must be our moment for action.